Let's go back to a supposed simpler time in America's recent history, when the biggest achievement of one man was successfully dodging not one, but two flying shoes. That's right, buckle up folks, we're discussing how W became president of this here United States.
Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, fool me once, shame on you. It fooled me, we can't get fooled again.
Welcome back to Wine and Chill. I'm Stephanie, your favorite recovering lawyer, and if you're new here, don't worry, because we're trying a new series. Welcome to our newest series, Throwback Lawsuits, where I discuss the varying major lawsuits that changed the course of American history. Before he rebranded himself as Michelle Obama's favorite Candyman, George Bush was rightfully the most hated president in America's recent history. We're talking And in case if you're too young to remember, or because you're so stressed from the memory so you've wiped him from your memory, let me remind you of his rap sheet. He started a necessary war to make his VP Dick Cheney and Halliburton almost as rich as the future Bezos. I mean, find weapons of mass destruction. Just to later admit that there were indeed no weapons of mass destruction.
The fact that there wasn't weapons involved. I mean, when we first got in there and started looking around and didn't find anything, you get that kind of sinking feeling that
caused the murder during the war on Iraq of approximately 315,190 Iraqi civilians, again in a country with no weapons of mass destruction. This number has been updated in recent years because all the devastation that has occurred in Iraq over the past 2 decades to be an estimated 2 million people. Also responsible for America's longest running war, the war on Afghanistan, where 47,245 Afghan civilians were murdered. He then had the military recruit young people in America's poorest communities to fight said war, over 3,000 of which went over just to simply die. He watched for a week as residents of New Orleans literally drowned during Hurricane Katrina.
George Bush doesn't care about black people. Please call.
In the past few days.
And of course you remember that time he chose to do a photo op with children while the Twin Towers were literally falling instead of doing his damn job. But alas, that darn rebrand has turned former President George W. Bush into something of a lovable idiot, a meme if you may. To figure out how the hell we ended up with the nefarious incompetence of George W. Bush, we have to go back to one of the most maligned, contested, and history-altering cases since Dred v. Scott. We're going back to the year 2000 and the Supreme Court case of Bush v. Gore. The year is 2000 and all I want for Christmas is for another Tamagotchi or for my possessed Furby to simply be quiet. Yes, that same Furby that I begged for last year, I want it to die. I'm not even joking. Or at least the batteries to remove itself. I mean, I could have removed the batteries, but somehow I really believe that the thing would still keep talking in the middle of the night to itself. In this, the world is ending, everyone is faux afraid of the millennium, Florida is still Florida. We have Florida, gators, foolery, and most important to the heart of this video, Florida is at the heart of the then most contested election in history. 2020 happened and history is repeating itself because history is ironically banned in Florida schools. I mean that facetiously, and also, insert these headlines. So we can't have the Supreme Court case Bush v. Gore without a one Al Gore himself. Al Gore, Clinton's vice president for 8 years, he famously invented the internet. Well, he went on the news and told everyone in 1999.
During my service in the United States Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet.
Negro, please.
Of course, people love to joke, and people continuously taunted him for years and years saying, now Gore, sweetie, you did a lot of things, but invent the internet by yourself? You did not. He, I would say, is probably one of the most memorable sound bites of the early 2000s. Which is why millennials of a certain age refer to the internet still as Gore's internet. Also, it's me. I'm a millennial of a certain age. The actual truth of the matter that in the 1970s, Congressman Al Gore did introduce numerous legislation to champion the then burgeoning internet. So without Al Gore pushing along our very slow government, we might not have the internet as we do today. So yes, while now it's Beyonce's internet 365 days a year, and you know what? We might have some videos coming up about that. On a leap year, aka this year, it's Al Gore's internet. Depending on what news outlet you pull the actual votes from, you'll still find 23 years later a different vote count for Florida in the 2000 election, which I wrote this outline in the year 2023. We're now in 2024. Shout out to me for finally pulling myself out of that slump. So 24 years later, you're gonna get a couple different answers. However, all of those news sources generally agree that the popular vote of Florida was won by Al Gore. But in the year 2000, the fate of the entire country and arguably other parts of the world, because without Bush being president and Dick Cheney being his vice president, you know what? We may not have invaded countries who were simply minding their business and again, never had any weapons of mass destruction. And all of that hinged on 537 votes in Florida. Due to widespread voter disenfranchisement in Black and Spanish-speaking communities across Duval County, Miami-Dade County, and Palm Beach County. Shout out to everyone else whose day made, all the kids from the 305, keeping it all the way live. And you know what? Just trying to live through Ron DeSantis. I'm praying for y'all. I feel y'all. An estimated 45,000 votes that would have went to Gore were never counted.
Wait a damn minute. Wait a damn.
This sounds strikingly, creepily, and dishearteningly very similar to what's currently going on. While this is the era of Al Gore's internet, that internet was dial-up, and the voting machines throughout Florida varied from county to county but largely relied on hole punching. Generally, the candidate's name was supposed to be next to their respective hole punch, but ballots in Palm Beach County confusingly moved Al Gore's hole from the third slot to the second slot. Talking about Al Gore's holes is a little uncomfortable. I'm sorry, sir. I mean it in the most respectful manner. This butterfly ballot, as it was called, caused nothing but chaos and consternation. Remember the hole punching, though, in all the holes. It's going to come up later as we discuss dimpled chads, pregnant chads, and all types of chads. For some odd reason, it's literally called Chad in the Supreme Court case as well as the state cases. And as we know, nothing but chaos and consternation comes from Chads.
Chad, please.
That has not changed in 24 years. To make this case even more interesting before we even get to the case, if you remember, or if you have been reminded by a millennial, a Gen X, a boomer, or some from the silent generation that this could all be very different right now, on election night, all of the major news outlets, except one, called Florida for Al Gore. There are literal celebrations recorded on television.
A big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column.
Shout out to the incomparable Michael Moore, who most famously is the director and documentarian behind Fahrenheit 9/11, for capturing this in film. Also, that documentary has aged very well. Highly recommend rewatching it. Then, all of a sudden, Fox News. Yeah, this is the beginning of Fox News as the villain. Reported that Florida was actually won by Bush. Fox News was run at the time by W's first cousin, John Ellis. I kid you not, his literal first cousin. Specifically, from this article, Ellis's projection was crucial because Fox News Channel put Florida in the W column at 2:16 a.m., followed by NBC, CBS, CNN, and ABC within 4 minutes. That decision, which turned out to be wrong and was retracted by the embarrassed networks less than 2 hours later, this is going on in the wee hours of the morning, created the impression that Bush had won the White House. Specifically, on election night, John Ellis called his other first cousin Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush, who is George Bush's younger brother. Jeb Bush, who was at the time the governor of Florida, the state in question, and said, and quote, according to The Nation, "Jebby says we got it. Jebby says we got it." He excitedly announced that decision to his team. Jebby, who championed the FCAT, and Jebby, who I know to this day is mad that his brother, who is not as smart as him, and you know what? Maybe a little less nefarious than him, got to be a president, while Jebby never could. And you know what? That makes the Florida kid in me happy, because I detest Jeb Bush. Probably a smidge more than I detest George Bush. So, in case you're keeping track of Bush's Florida home team, let's lay it out. First, again, we have Governor Jebby Bush, his best little brother, who again never got to be the president of this here United States and likely never will. John Ellis, his first cousin at Fox News. The Florida Secretary of Elections, Katherine Harris, was also Bush's Florida campaign manager. HW really stacked the deck for his most unimpressive son. As all of this is going on at 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, Gore conceded to Bush, and then after his team realized, hey, there's some funny business, he unconceded. And then we proceeded to not have a president-elect for almost a month. Yeah, 2000 was a chaotic time. So according to Florida law at the time, because the race was so close, we're talking about 537 counted votes, not even including the alleged 40,000 plus votes that they refused to count, Florida law required a recount. The election occurred on November 7th. By November 10th, a mandatory Florida statewide election recount was underway, but the results were still too close to call. While votes were still contested as not being fully counted, Katherine Harris, again, this is Bush's friend, who is also running his campaign and somehow is in charge of elections in the state. The conflict of interest, I don't guess who was in charge of checking that. They just decided to log out for the day. She then attempted to certify the results on November 11th because to hell with fair elections. Gore's team then sued in Florida court and won a manual recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court on December 8th, 2020. Now remember, the election was on November 7th. Yeah, 5th grade was a wild time. We were all just sitting there like, so are we discussed in civics class how this is supposed to go? This is not going how it's supposed to go at all. And we're in Florida. And specifically, we're in Miami. It was an interesting time. Actually, that's when I lived in West Palm. So the Florida Supreme Court ordered a statewide manual recount of approximately 45,000 undervotes, ballots that machines recorded as not clearly expressing a presidential vote, and accepted some previously uncertified results in both Miami-Dade County and Palm Beach County. Again, most of these votes were Black residents as well as Spanish-speaking residents, aka people that the Republicans did not want to count their votes. The Florida court initially ruled for Al Gore, which the Bush campaign was having none of that. You know, HW didn't seduce and scheme all of that for his son for all of this commotion to happen. Allegedly. Sir, you didn't even cover it up good.
This was supposed to be just a little simple bit of election rigging!
When the Florida Supreme Court ordered the manual recount on December 8th, the Bush team then made a move that nobody expected. They then brought an appeal with the Supreme Court of the United States, which skipped a lot of steps, to be honest. And by a lot of steps, nobody had ever seen anything of this magnitude ever happen before. So the first case was called Bush v. Palm Beach County Canvassing Board, which asked the court to vacate the Florida Supreme Court ruling of the recount. This stay was granted in less than 23 hours. This should be noted because in the most recent years, our very conservative Supreme Court has done lots of interesting things with a lot of our rights, and none of them occurred in 23 hours. Not one. Months. Many months. Slowly, but surely. 23 hours? Clarence doesn't work like that. Let's be serious. That man is a lot of things, but a quick, speedy worker, he is not. The Florida Supreme Court issued their opinion at 4 p.m. on December 8th. The United States Supreme Court granted the stay at 2:45 p.m. on December 9th. In less than 23 hours, 5 justices evidently had decided that Governor Bush was sure to prevail because in the view of the harm of the vice president, the stay could not possibly be justified if there had been any doubt. The justices reached this decision even though they had little or no prior familiarity with the state law involved. So they magically read and heard all of this learned knowledge about how Florida state law worked. Florida, a state who everyone knows is not a straight line, is a convoluted gator mess. Somehow they understood Florida election law so quickly to issue this ruling. I'm not buying it. And even though they were acting on the basis of a very hastily prepared stay application in opposition, it is hard to resist the conclusion that they knew all along what they were going to do. SCOTUS then vacated means to get rid of and to be like, you know what? I know you ruled that, you lower court, but again, I am SCOTUS. I'm all-knowing, all-seeing, and to hell with you. They vacated the Florida Supreme Court manual recount and remanded the case for clarification, which brings us to the case at hand, which is the infamous Bush v. Gore case. The sole SCOTUS case where 5 Supreme Court justices picked their very own president. Now, this is unprecedented again in terms of time, The Supreme Court doesn't work that fast. Very wild. In terms of the actual subject matter of the case, this should have been decided by the Florida State Supreme Court because this is Florida election law. And also, in terms of, at the time, you have a very conservative court who were all for states' rights, all of a sudden saying, to hell with the states' rights, we're going with W. So the question of law in Bush v. Gore was, remember when I said to put a footnote in your mind about the Chads, in the ballots and the hole punching in the holes? That is because the SCOTUS case centered all around the dimpled Chads, the pregnant Chads, it's literally called pregnant Chad, and just Chads in general. So Justice Souter, one of his questions was, it is your position that if any official, judicial, or executive at this point were to purport to lay down a statewide standard which went to a lower level, a more specific level than the intent of the voter, and said, for example, count dimpled Chads or don't count dimpled Chads. In your judgment, would that be a violation of Article 2? Then you have the responding lawyer saying, if we went from the standard that existed before the dimpled Chads, that had not been a standard anywhere in Florida, if that change was made, we would strongly urge that would be a violation of Article 2. And it goes on and it goes on. So what the hell is a dimpled Chad, a pregnant Chad, or a regular Chad? A Chad is a tiny scored portion of a paper ballot that voters punch using a small stylus to indicate their preference for a candidate. Judge Robert Rosenberg of the Broward County Canvassing Board uses a magnifying glass to examine a dimpled Chad on a punch card ballot on November 24th, 2000 during a vote recount in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. As you can see, he's looking intensely at the Chad. According to the ABC News, Palm Beach County defined the types of Chads as: so regular Chad, the scored portion of the ballot card that is punched out when a voter casts a vote. Hanging door Chad, one corner is still attached to the ballot, counted as a vote. Swinging door Chad, two corners are still attached to the ballot, counted as a vote. Try Chad, not me, but really though. Three corners are still attached to the ballot, counted as a vote. Dimpled Chad, the problematic Chad is the dimpled Chad. Indented but still fully attached to the ballot, not counted as a vote. And the pregnant Chad. The pregnant Chad, unfortunately, in today's current society in 2024, has no rights because we have undone Roe v. Wade. Back to the case at hand.
Girl, stop playing with us right now. Like, we really don't.
Pierced but still fully attached to the ballot, not counted as a vote. So, as we have read through the varying definitions of all the Chads, this Chad technology obviously caused a lot of issues with Florida laws, specifically because what type of Chad and which Chad counted and didn't count it as a vote varied by county. In the instance where a hole punch was not completely punched out, it was up to then members of the election committee to then look and determine what was the voter's intent for that specific Chad. Because due to partial holes, voting machines had trouble reading the Chads. I think we all have trouble reading the Chads, you know. They're a little spacey, a little airbrained, if you may.
My favorite subject? English, because I love words. I love hearing them, I love saying them. Right there was a perfect example of a sentence.
So the SCOTUS case rested on whether the Florida Supreme Court manual recount that the Florida Supreme Court ordered, whether or not that recount was constitutional. Is it constitutional to count all the Chads? Chads have rights too, and they too deserve to be counted. Or put another way, the case hinged on whether or not the Florida Supreme Court, in ruling a manual recount of all the votes, if the Florida State Supreme Court violated election law by creating a new election law. Which, that question doesn't make a lick of sense, because the entire point of the judiciary is to mitigate when laws are violated, which is what the Florida State Supreme Court did. The new alleged election law, according to Bush and his team, in question was the Florida Supreme Court requiring a manual recount in which the Chads and ballots would be counted by hand. So, in very boring, superfluous legalese, the petition presents the following questions: whether the Florida Supreme Court established new standards for resolving presidential election contests, thereby violating Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution and failing to comply with 3 U.S.C. Section 5, and whether the use of standardless manual recounts violates the equal protection and due process clauses. Now, Let's skip forward in the years 2020, the other day. What occurred in numerous states, including Georgia? Manual recounts were required because it is that state, and specifically the judiciary in each state, it is their prerogative to say, all right, it's too close, we're confused. Okay, just in case, recount it again. They knew that 24 years ago too, in Bush v. Gore. George Bush and his team just decided to use an uncontested law in Article 2 to be like, you know what? Nobody really knows about this law. Nobody's really going to argue with us about this. Let's just put this forth in a short span of a day. And, let's see what happens. So specifically, what was being argued about was a specific section in the clause. In Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. The majority opinion reasoned that the Florida Supreme Court did not have the right to call a manual recount because that recount was making election law, and they were not the legislature. Broadly, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 grants powers and creates our Electoral College. Side note, our Electoral College needs a complete overhaul, which is how you get the 2016 election where one person wins the popular vote but somehow does not become Madam President. And yeah, there are issues with her that we could discuss at another time. Just saying. So one of the interesting things that I mentioned at the beginning was we see a group, because this is in the year 2000, in case you weren't alive or in case you forgot, you see a bunch of conservative judges. Conservative judges are often very loudly, states' rights, states' rights, states' rights. States' rights usually at the expense of everyone else. We see what states' rights in Texas, Alabama, Florida, Nebraska are doing to people. States' rights means I can undermine you and the federal government will not step in. Sadly, that's usually what is happening. All of these pro-states' rights people, including Justice Clarence Thomas, all of a sudden said, to hell with states' rights. And why was that? That was a bit interesting. So let's insert some very interesting and compensated alleged bias. Just so we're keeping count again, George Bush had on his team his first cousin at Fox News who called the election for him, Governor Jeb Bush, his baby brother, Florida Secretary of State Katherine Harris, who was also co-chair to his Florida campaign, and as we've seen in recent days and tangentially related, Clarence Thomas is allegedly a judicial sugar baby. And not only does he love billionaires and billionaires love him, the president that appointed him was no other than George H.W. Bush, George Bush's daddy. The puzzling question 24 years later is not would SCOTUS go through this whole charade, but why did SCOTUS even certify the case? Most cases that people ask to bring before the Supreme Court never make it to the Supreme Court. This is one such case. The court's decision to grant certiorari was very surprising to most observers, and it was a highly significant event. Among other things, it gave credibility to the extremely harsh attacks that Governor Bush's representatives made on the Florida Supreme Court. There was no obvious legal reason for the court to intervene. That is why its decision to do so surprised most observers. The central issues were ones of state law, and as their treatment of Section 5 shows, even Governor Bush's lawyers, with every incentive to find a federal question in the case, struggled to do so. While 7 justices agreed that there were constitutional problems with the recount, the disagreement was how and who should fix it, with 2 of those justices insisting that Florida needed to conduct the recount with standard parameters, aka everyone count the Chads the same, and 5 of the justices insisting that no recount was the way forward. Disenfranchising voters is never the right thing to do. This insistence that no recount was needed cost 45,000 people in Florida to literally lose their right to vote in the 2000 election. We hold these truths to be self-evident, etc., etc., etc. But not in Bush v. Gore. Key to the majority opinion was the mangling of the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. The Equal Protection Clause, which is codified in the 14th Amendment, states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. The 14th Amendment was specifically put in place to ensure that after the Civil War that Black Americans were allowed to live with dignity, fairness, and without slavery. It was also to guarantee that future laws were not weaponized against them by the state they lived in. Yet in one of the most foolish SCOTUS opinions ever written, Clarence Thomas and co. quite literally used the 14th Amendment to disenfranchise the voters it was meant to protect. The argument of the justices that voted in favor of not having a recount was that the recount would disenfranchise not the Black people of Florida, not the Spanish-speaking immigrants of Florida who also have the right to vote. No, it would disenfranchise the very privileged, the very wealthy George W. Bush. George W. Bush would be harmed if a recount occurred, according to the opinion. Where was the due process of law for Al Gore, who obviously would be harmed if the recount did not occur? The Due Process Clause is codified in the 5th Amendment, which is the federal version of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is specifically to say, hey, you have rights, and also the state cannot bother you. So specifically, we'll go to the one part of the Due Process Clause that is applicable here. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. This case was further rushed through by SCOTUS by one more statute. Since the original case was heard on December 9th, with the stay being granted, the court then invoked the December 12th safe harbor deadline. And so the ballot counting was stopped permanently, with George Bush conveniently in the lead by just a few hundred votes, when the majority invoked the December 12th safe harbor deadline envisioned by 3 U.S.C. Section 5. As the reason a remand was not possible, it disingenuously failed to note that it was the court's own stay days before that made compliance impossible, or that the safe harbor deadline merely protects the state electors from being challenged in Congress, and that the only real deadline that mattered was the day the electors would meet and vote together, which was December 18th and still 6 days off. And specifically with that December 12th safe harbor deadline, the deadline was put in place to protect electors. But, the George Bush legal team said, seems applicable enough here. And let's just throw that in, as if the country hadn't been waiting since November 7th to know who the hell the president was. Deep sigh. We could be living in a very different world right now. And that, my dears, is how we ended up with 2 wars, and nothing but unfiltered, unadulterated chaos, and many children left behind. I have a hypothesis that these children that were left behind are also podcast bros. But hey, we're not going to get into that right now. Okay, just saying. Now, 20 years later to the day, election 2020, we face another election denier. Even though Joseph Robinette Biden won the election, a one Donald J. Trump refused to concede. Instead, he and his team worked to spread the cancerous lie of election denial. This election denial culminated in the January 6th insurrection, where mostly white Trump supporters stormed the nation's capital, waving guns, Confederate flags, and an assortment of military-grade weaponry. They assaulted law enforcement, hung a noose in the square, screamed epithets, and ran through the halls searching for Democratic senators and representatives. Some insurrectionists even went so far as to steal documents and items from senators' offices, with the most uncouth putting their dirty shoes on elected officials' desks. That specifically showed a level of no brought up see. Dirty behavior. All of this occurred while a one Donald J. Trump cheered them on and said, "Take your country back." Clearly, he's in need of a history lesson as to whose land this country was actually built on. Stolen from. Okay. The days leading to the planned insurrection, Trump's team, with the help of Fox News, look at Fox News 20 years later, still showing the crack of its ass, and right-wing outlets began to spread the lie that Dominion Voting Systems, a small voting machine company, was responsible for allowing illegal votes. 4 years later, and many litigations later, Dominion Voting Systems has been vindicated. This led to one of the largest defamation lawsuits in history, where Fox News was forced to settle and pay out $787 million to Dominion Voting Systems for damages not only done to the company, but to the employees who received numerous death threats from uneducated, unhinged, and quite frankly, dedicated ignorant people. Now, none of this election denial happened in a vacuum. We are currently living through one of the largest attacks on voting rights.
Instead, they went for option B, try to make voting harder. And they used Trump's delusional election lie as cover. Now take a look at the conservative National Review. It recently argued the Republic would be better served by having fewer, but better voters. We're seeing this play out across the country. Georgia's new law allows unlimited challenges to a voter's registration, requires ID for an absentee ballot, and expands the legislature's power over elections. Texas is considering a law that would, among other things, reduce early voting and prohibit drive-through voting. Unsurprisingly, the bills and laws target predominantly diverse communities.
Last month, the Supreme Court released a shadow docket ruling reinstated Louisiana's GOP-drawn unrepresentative congressional maps. This sends Louisiana back to a tarnished history of diminishing the votes and voices of African Americans. It's shameful that the court refused maps that fairly represent the population of Louisiana.
Despite the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal rights and equal protection to Black people, we are watching the Supreme Court 24 years later dismantle those very same rights. Specifically, across many states, we have been seeing the chipping away at the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But with all this dismal, disgruntled, downright foolery, there's a little bit of hope. There are various coalitions such as the peoplesagenda.org, as well as rising third, fourth, and fifth parties. Hello! I'm just saying other countries, democratic countries, have more than 2 parties. 2 parties is not the norm nor the standard on the world stage. We need a Labor Party for the people. I'm just gonna put that out there. We can have a country with more than 2 parties. We simply have to loudly organize for it. So on that note, as always, I appreciate y'all and thank you for watching our first installment of Throwback Lawsuits. Let me know any throwback lawsuits you'd like to see in this series. And on that note, if you haven't already, please go ahead, like, subscribe, or dislike if you happen to be a one George W. Bush. Sorry to you. All right, I'll catch y'all later.
So what if the guy threw a shoe at me? It doesn't bother me. And if you want the facts, it's a size 10 shoe that he threw.
Surely that's not me.
Well,
Please.
let's find out.
It'll take time to restore chaos. There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you." If fool me, we can't get fooled again.